Welcome to the Rig Doctor podcast, where I'm giving out remedies to soothe your ailing tone and fix your sick pedal boards. I'm your host, Mason Marangella, aka the Rig Doctor. I've been building rigs for over a decade for many of the industry's top pros, and now I'm giving away all my tips and secrets to DIYers just like you. I'm giving away tricks, tips, resources, and easy hacks that I've learned over the years, and inviting in some guests to talk about some of their own tricks and tips so that you can build a rig just like a pro. In today's episode, I'm going to be speaking with Grant from Goodwood Audio. Grant is one of the founders of Goodwood and started it back in Sydney, Australia, and has grown this to be a multi-location business where he has an Australian branch and a North American branch and a Canadian branch, and he's actually joining me from Canada today so that we can have this conversation about how Goodwood started and how he built out one of the most successful pedalboard companies in the world and makes some of the most revered pedalboard-based products in terms of buffer, interface boxes, and insert loops, and all sorts of accessories that are designed explicitly for pedal boards. So without further ado, let's go to Grant. Let's talk pedal boards with another guy that's building pedal boards. Doctor to doctor, let's talk with Grant. Well, cool. Well, Grant, welcome to the podcast, and I have to, just say that I admire what you guys are doing at Goodwood. I know that when we had sort of spoken offline, that you didn't realize that I wasn't really offering any sort of pedal board related services. And I've always kind of, at least at a distance, sort of looked at all the different companies that were offering these sorts of services, and certainly, the rigs look beautiful, and you guys have certainly, I think, owned a territory of sort of clientele and rig building. I think especially in the church and kind of CCM community. So I'm really interested to kind of hear the trajectory and how you got to where you are, and what the path looked like to kind of get to Goodwood version 2021. So welcome, and tell me, like, how did Goodwood start? Like, what is the name in and of itself?
Oh,
what's the purpose? What's the meaning?
So firstly, thanks for having me. And Goodwood started back in 2010. I had a random buddy who we wanted to get free cables. I didn't want to pay for my cables, and I didn't want to go and start stealing from my local music store. So we figured we'd learn how to solder and make our own soldered instrument leads, and so we sold them to our friends. We tried to sell to family, people that didn't play guitar, try and make them feel a little bit guilty for not supporting their business, even though they don't play music. So we sold as many as we could. We got our free cables, and that kind of just petered off. So I came out of that knowing how to solder, and then a guy named Mikey, who I think Mikey as well. A New Zealander guy we met in Sydney, Australia. He came up to me and was like, have you ever considered doing custom setups? And so basically he would, arrange all the pedals, as you guys, the people that are listening would know, arrange all the pedals, work on the signal chain, do soldered cables. And so I just said, why not? Let's give it a go. We did that for a hobby for maybe 5 years or so, just kind of for fun. And within the first year, we had some of the guys from a church in Sydney called Hillsong. A lot of the, churchgoers will know what that one is. And Nigel Hendroff was one of the guitar players, and he basically entrusted us with his rig. He tours around the world. He trusted a bunch of guys that had no idea what they were doing to set up his board, and it was just an experiment. And me and Mikey had the best time with this, and made some rookie mistakes. I look back at the first things we built, and I don't know how they worked, man. It was rough. But as you do, every setup you learn, you adjust, you make changes, and next thing you know, in I guess it was 2017, I went full time, and so not too long ago. But from there we grew and moved out of Sydney. And now we're set up in a couple different places around the world, and here we are. This is version 2021, like you were saying.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that's what you were saying that sort of caught my attention is that you when you built some of these early incarnations in particular for Nigel, that you wondered how some of them would work, and there's certainly an arc of learning. And I think a lot of times when people are seeing these completed rigs on Instagram, or we're thinking about any of the legacy pedal board guys that maybe people have or sort of looked to as sort of the godfathers, the Robert Bradshaws and the Dave Friedmans and guys like that of the world, that they all started somewhere, totally. and that you definitely have to walk before you can crawl. And some people maybe come from a more of a technical background, and then maybe they get into doing this stuff. Or maybe they sort of learn organically in through kind of the trial and error, or maybe a combination thereof. And what would you say is sort of like clearly that there was you were experimenting. How have you sort of really relied on experiential learning in terms of informing kind of how the rigs have adapted between 2010 and in 2021 over the last 11 years, or do you have to supplement? Do you supplement with learning electronics based stuff, or are you kind of relying on other contractors to kind of help fill in those gaps for you, where you need to have sort of customization and stuff like that? Because certainly you guys have grown the business to do not just services, but also have a range of products with buffers and interfaces and insert loops and things of that nature that are kind of for maybe DIYers to take individual pieces and apply them to their boards. Can you talk on that?
Yeah, so there's a couple different areas in the business. There's the custom setups, which we're trying to get the most out of gear that customers already own for the most part. So that would be a lot of self-taught stuff, a lot of experimenting, especially when it comes to signal chain. And that's probably a whole nother podcast of, what's the best signal chain, as I do air quotes. And so there's that side of the business, and that was a lot of just experimenting. I remember really quick, the first board I ever did was my own. And me and Mikey, while we were testing the concept, we set it up, and we forgot to peel away, I forgot to peel away the
conductive plastic
every cable. And I'm like, I'm done. Every cable is tested. It works. I bring it off. At that point, I was playing at church at Hillsong. I bring it off, excited to show all my buddies, the new setup. And it sounds like someone took a thick blanket and dropped it over top of my amp and then mic'd it up. Yeah. And so that was hours of redoing the work I just finished and fixing every cable and all that. The other side was circuits. Was more, it started out self-taught, looked on YouTube how to use, CAD soft, an Eagle design program for circuits. And then from there, quickly realized I had no idea what I was doing, and quickly tried to find people that knew a lot more than I did, and textbooks and all that type of stuff. And so I went to guys like, John from Bondi Effects and some of the guys at GFI. These guys, they're just awesome at what they do, and they really know their stuff. And so I guess to, answer your question, it's been started out with me just having no clue and absolutely loving it. I could have no clue all day long in a shop with a soldering iron, and I'm happy. But then when it comes to selling products, you really have to put something out that, will work and will work with many different types of gear. So I had to get other people in to help me out and ask them questions and all that. So it's been a mix of contractors asking questions and just a whole lot of experimenting myself and seeing what works.
Yeah. And so when you sort of, one of the products that I think most people identify you for is the interface boxes, or the commercially available one. I think you guys also do, from what I can see from Instagram, custom variations of the interface box. How did that come to be? Has that been the same kind of basic circuit in terms of the buffer since it began? Is it adapted? Like what did kind of the what did kind of the arc of the interface boxes look like?
Yeah, so that started way back. It must have been 2011, 2012. A customer asked us if we could build a custom box for them that took their stereo delay and, by hitting a switch, they could send it out to 1 amp instead of 2, depending on where they're playing. And so, being the optimist that I am, I was like, yeah, of course we can do that. And then I went away and tried to figure it out. And again, looking back, I did a very rough job on that initial box. But that was like the first interfacer.
Right.
I have looked back, just out of curiosity, I've looked back recently on how many iterations of the interfacer I've done since around that 2011 time. It would be about 120 to 130 different circuits and different variations of that one product. And most of that is, again, because I was just learning. So I would try one, it wouldn't quite work, and I'd have to adjust. But we've gone from transistor-based versions to op-amp-based, to dual rail supplies, relays versus 3PDT switches. Like, we've done so many approaches to it. And only now do I feel really confident in, this is the best version that we've ever done. And I'm still going to make changes in the future as I learn and grow. But that's kind of how it began. And yeah, as I said, we probably, on average, there would be slight changes every month or two that we would make. And most people wouldn't need to know about and don't care about, but every once in a while, it would be, we've added multiple types of muting, or we've updated this feature on it, and whatever it might be. And so it's changed a lot, and it probably will still change again in the future, but it's definitely the flagship product, the one that most people ask about, for sure.
Yeah, I know that it gets brought up. It gets brought up in our conversation chats and stuff like that, in our videos often. And I don't really know much about it, other than you had sent us one for the giveaway that we're going to be incorporating onto this giveaway pedal board. But it'll be interesting to kind of get to know it a little bit better, and kind of get into it, other than what you've sort of just told me anecdotally. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and this is also another thing I think is kind of broad customer-based questions, and we've done a little bit of video kind of talking about this, is about the summing. And this is something that I noticed that a lot of people have really gotten into in maybe the last 5 years or so. And I've always really just encouraged people to not sum the stereo to mono. I think some people think it's this panacea that it's going to sound, almost equivalent to what their stereo image might sound like, but through 1 amp. And it's been difficult to convince people that there really isn't an external hardware that can merge internal software to work the same way in mono as it does in stereo if it's already hardwired for that application. What's your read on that as somebody that is making, it looks like, from what I can tell from the interfacer, that it can go either way. So you could actually just use the left output and maintain the stereo. There's no sum whatsoever, or you can merge them into a sum. What's your sort of read on, where you sort of fall in the recommendations of when is the appropriate time to do it versus not?
Yeah, it's actually a great thing, and a great question, because we've done videos on this as well, basically pointing out summing is not a perfect science. It's not going to solve all of your issues, just like you were saying, and I know that you've done videos on as well. It started out as a fail-safe. So guys on tour are using 2 amps or whatever it might be, and they don't tour with a tech, which is the majority of people that tour. They need a really quick solution. They don't know which amp has died. They just hear something's dead in their ears, so they can flip a switch or hold down a button, and they will get their whole stereo signal, imperfect as it is, summed to both of their amps, both the working and the not working amp. And so that's why the summing kind of started. And then our customers kind of took it from there and was like, oh, I want this as an option all the time. I don't want to have to rewire my rig, which is fair enough. And so I will tell them, the most extreme example, if you have a stereo tremolo on your board and you sum it, it's going to sound like you bypassed your tremolo entirely and you just moved on to the next effect. It won't show up.
Right, because the polarity of
Exactly. And so I'll basically go through my, this with my customers, saying that if you primarily run a digital delay and a digital reverb in stereo, you'll notice it much, much less when you sum. Whereas if you do something that is messing around with either pitch, like a chorus will diminish quite a lot when you sum it. But if you take a Boss DD5 and sum it, it'll be a lot more accurate to just plugging one cable in and one cable out going in mono. But it's so true. And it would be so much better if there was a piece of hardware that could take care of that. My my products would be more applicable to more people, but it just unfortunately isn't the case. So yeah, summing is not perfect. It's one of the reasons actually we added 2 types of summing to our boxes. So you can actually, and again, both are not perfect. Both have trade-offs. But the second type of summing, you can basically mute the right input and then split the left input to both the left and right outputs when summed. So it gets rid of phasing, but obviously it gets rid of half of your stereo signal as well. So it's not perfect as well.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I've told people when I was doing more rigs and obviously I don't really do them anymore other than for the purposes of enrichment, or if it's to teach a specific skill that's being asked about for YouTube, is that I remember doing a rig once where somebody wanted this, and I said, well, really the only way that you could do this is if I go into each one of your devices and we put a toggle switch that actually shorts the stereo output in the stereo, or the stereo input. Usually the input is what determines if the stereo output is going to be active or not. So if there's nothing plugged in, that second input, then usually that's fine. So I remember I had to go into each of the circuits, and luckily they were not complicated circuits that required me to do any additional homework, but I basically had to put toggle switches that would be like a stereo mono switch that would basically make the jack think as though there was nothing plugged into it, even though there was something plugged into it, so that it would occur from the hardware standpoint inside the pedal that it was still connected in mono. The problem is if the guy ever forgot to move it back to stereo, then it didn't work so well.
Yeah.
But that was really, and still is really, the only way that you can really get a true mono and a true stereo. There's no external box, unfortunately, they can do it. But I think that the mythology from the customer perspective, maybe through no fault of your own or anything that I've ever said about summing, that I think people think it's just the same thing as, not understanding. Then the other component too to that is that in a lot of these mixes, they're not 50 left and 50 right.
Yeah.
I always thought that somebody more sophisticated than me would come up with some sort of a programmable mixing pot, as part of their sum. And so, through MIDI, you could determine, how much left and how much right was going to be, mixed in at the end, when you're going to do it. And if it's not just going to be a 50-50 left and right sum. Yeah. And you could adjust it based on the parameter. But on some of the stuff too, like the DD500, you can hard pan your output. So a lot of times if you want to do mono, you kind of can, just by way of presets. And so on mine, I just have all my odd numbers are mono and all my even numbers are stereo of the same preset.
Yep.
So 1 and 2 are the same presets as 1 is, would be a hard panned version when I have to run the stereo rig in mono.
Which is another reason why one of the most underrated multi-effect delays in my mind is still the time factor, because of its additional kind of control in that kind of area as well. And it's got some of those options available, but yeah, I mean, if you have some of these pedals like an H9 as well, can give you more control whether you're in stereo or mono or whatever with presets. But it's something you have to really think through ahead of time and almost choose your pedals accordingly if you want to perfectly accomplish not plugging and unplugging every single time you change from stereo to mono.
Yeah, I noticed that. I don't know if you've caught wind of this, but I noticed that a lot of the Eventide pedals, people have been really hard on them lately, and this trend of the analog dry through has really seemed to have a little bit more momentum and inertia than I've noticed it in years past. Like nobody could care less about it when the Line 6 DL4 was out, or even when the Time Factor or any of the Factor pedals or the H9 for that matter were out. I don't think people really even thought about it then, and I just noticed it kind of come up recently because some of the newer Walrus products don't have an analog dry, and that people are like freaking out that somehow that their tone is going to now be destroyed.
Yeah,
and it wasn't even an afterthought for the last, like 20 years when most of the digital pedals didn't have that. Have you found this to be something that is problematic, or do you have an opinion on the analog drive-through thing? Speaking, in particular, like things like the Time Factor H9, I think those are two products that were sort of, flagship products, certainly before the Timeline came out. I think that the Time Factor was kind of the delay.
Yeah.
Do you have any opinion on that you would want to share with people that might be listening as to whether, talk them off the ledge if that's where you stand on this?
I mean, to be honest, in short, I don't have a huge opinion on it. I think no matter where we are as far as pedals and guitar goes, there's going to be some hot topic that is, that is going to be the way to build a pedal.
Right.
It always has to have analog drive-through. It always has to be true bypass, which was the big one, 5-10 years ago. Is my whole pedal board's true bypass, and the pitfalls that come with having a board like that. And so at the end of the day, honestly, I get the pedal. A lot of times, as you would as well, when you were doing setups, you'd get the customer gear in, you'd have a play with it, and you either like the pedal or you don't like it. And maybe that is the drive-through or the lack thereof, and that contributes to the sound or how you feel about the pedal. At the end of the day, though, and I know you're an advocate for this, if you have a great buffer at the beginning, a great buffer at the end, and you like the way that the pedal makes you play and how the sounds that you can get out of it, I don't worry about much else. Like, I want my board to sound great. I want to enjoy playing music through it, and I don't worry too much, beyond that. Assuming that I have a good input and output buffer, I leave the rest aside. I know it's probably not the most scientific answer, and people are not going to like that answer, but I just don't want to get too hung up on some of that stuff when ultimately, at the end of the day, I've got a lot of it taken care of at the beginning and end of my board.
Right. Well, I think that the fear that some people have is that they look at some of these devices in isolation and they say, well, this is going to convert my whole signal to digital, and that's irreversible. Not sort of understanding that they're going into their DAW and they're going in to Pro Tools, totally digital. And I think that there's still a lot of analog that insulates any digital product in terms of its its conversion. So it's not completely irreversible. But the other thing I always thought is if you thought it was so bad, the easiest thing to determine as to the degree that it was affecting things. I mean, you could put it in a true bypass loop, leave it in bypass and bring it in and out and see if there's anything that was detectable. And if there were, you could always just put it into a single parallel mixer. Guys like Lely and things like that make parallel mixers that are just single channel, and that can provide your analog dry.
Yep.
So there you go. If you really love a Time Factor and now you can't love it anymore because you found out that it's got warts, it's got digital DSP switching. Just you put it into the parallel mixer, and now the day is saved.
Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting concept because I too really like the Time Factor, and I think it's a really, really it just didn't have enough time in the sun because it was overtaken by the Strymon wave, which just had so much momentum.
Yeah.
and there was just like, hit after hit after hit after hit in terms of products that I don't think it got its due. But man, that is still, I think, such a easy interface and such a great sounding delay that certainly a sleeper pedal, and that's something I want to talk to you too about at the end is Grant's sleeper pedals that or even just your ordinary picks in sort of the broad categories, so we can kind of circle back to that when we get closer to the end. But the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, which I think, among the pedalboard guys, I'm kind of just going through the Rolodex here of things that I see that come up really frequently in our comment section, and things where it's nice to kind of test drive some of these ideas against people that are actually doing this sort of thing, so that it doesn't just rattle around in the four corners of my brain. The wet dry and the wet dry wet thing, it seems to have also kind of had a lot of momentum. It seems like there's an incredible amount of misunderstanding about what this is, and my challenge has been sort of how to balance like the sort of traditional understanding of it versus the new understanding, and sometimes I feel like I'm like the old guy that's like telling people to get off their lawn in a way, because I feel like I have this really finite understanding of what it meant based on this particular point in time when it came to fruition. And not that I should really have any particular say in it, because I was really young when this sort of concept was invented. So it wasn't like I lived through, the experiment of wet, dry, wet myself. But as I, got into learning this stuff, I kind of, that was one of the kind of pillars of sort of understanding rig setups and things like that I learned. And it seems like such a departure if people are just putting splitters in front of 2 amps and there's all these preamps involved, or 3 amps. And so I kind of wonder how much of it is just like a dogma that I've adopted versus it, maybe there being able to be some new reappropriation of the terminology, and that, do you have a sense of kind of like, what do you think is sort of do you see wet, dry, wet as sort of like a spectrum of just having multiple amps, or what do you kind of see from your clientele as sort of the understanding, and then do you kind of try to filter them into a certain way of doing it, or are you sort of just saying, like, you call it whatever you want, we're just going to make it this way?
It comes up. I talk to customers about it every week, and because we still do setups, the first thing that we do in assessing a new job is I get on the phone and I talk to a customer. And if the customer says, I want a wet, dry, wet rig, I know my phone call is going to double in length instantly. Because like half of it, people see rigs that are hooked up in wet, dry, wet, and they love the sound of it. And they're like, okay, well, now I want a wet, dry, wet rig. As if it's the same as like, oh, I heard a ping-ponging delay, so now I want a stereo rig. And when I say my phone call doubles, it's because I have to go through the education process of, all right, when you say wet, dry, wet, what do you mean? Right. And so what I've done is I've created videos on our YouTube channel, and even the terms I've given them, I'm aware of are not correct. I call a traditional wet, dry, wet, which is not traditional, but it separates the two approaches I take. A traditional wet, dry, wet is when you get into parallel wet effects and you're running kill dry, pedals in kill dry. This is obviously not to be confused with the traditional wet, dry, wet, where you're using your preamp on your amplifier, and then you're going into mixers and you're splitting and going kill dry that way. But just to give people a better understanding, I basically just say, do you want to run your pedals in parallel? And there's pros and cons to this as well. It's not better than running your wet effects in series, it's different. And so as soon as I tell people, if you want to run stereo effects in parallel, you're going to need additional gear. You're going to need to think about ground loops if you're going to run more than 1 amp. If you're going to run 3 amps, you're going to need to really think about ground loops and phase, even more so. And as soon as I start, explaining what it means to have parallel effects and what it means to run your effects in kill dry, which I have to say as a side note is different than turning your mix knob up to 100%. That's a whole nother thing. Like, there's just so much to cover. And so essentially what I've boiled it down to, for my customers at least, a lot of the time, is they want either to just have a dry amp and run a series pedal board, which I call a pseudo wet dry wet rig. It's not a true wet dry wet. You're not running anything in parallel. Yeah. You're not using any effects loops on your amps, like none of that. And so I basically just say, if you do a dry out and everything else stays the same, so you're running everything in series, you will notice the benefit of additional transients. You'll hear more from your fingers. You'll hear more from the pick attack out of that dry amp. It won't get oversaturated or muddy because you're running your wet effects a little high on the mix end, which we love to do. So basically, the majority of them just want that, and it's simple. And one other side note for people that are listening, one of the most important things you can do if you want to run a dry amp is give yourself an easy way to mute it. Because if you don't have an easy way to mute that amp and you want to do an ambient patch, the first thing people don't think about is every little alternate picking thing you're doing on your strings of your guitar is going to go through that dry amp. It's also going to go through your wet effects. And so it sounds really ugly. It sounds terrible if you can't mute it. And so all that to say, in short, I think wet, dry, wet, it's definitely started coming up on a weekly basis over the past 4 years. And I love it because, again, experimenting at home, I ran a wet, dry, wet rig, with parallel wet effects and all that. I couldn't do any effects loops on my amps. So I did, kind of a halfway between the real traditional wet, dry, wet and a pseudo where you're just doing a dry out. And I absolutely loved it. And the great thing about it is front of house could mix my wet effects and my dry amp how they wanted it. And I could mix it in my ears how I wanted it. And everyone kind of gets the best of both worlds. But yeah, I mean, in short, as soon as you go into the whole wet, dry, wet conversation, just don't rush into it. Like, do some research, ask some questions, try things out at home. I always encourage people just to take, even if it's their Boss tuner or their micropog, like anything that has two outputs that you can just turn off and use it as just a split. Just try it out at home with a dry amp and just run your wet effects in series and just see if you like it. And then go dip your toes into parallel effects down the track. But I wouldn't encourage people, and I don't encourage people to go from maybe they currently have a mono pedal board and everything's running in series to one amp. And then a lot of people want to jump straight into kill dry, parallel effects, stereo wet, one dry amp, isolation, phase correct. Like, they want to just go from 0 to 100. Just take your time and just do some experimenting at home and see if you like it first before investing money in this additional gear and this learning curve that comes along with it.
Yeah, I think that it is wise, and one of the things that I noticed, now and also when I was doing this in a professional context, is that people's eyes are really bigger than their stomachs when it comes to building rigs, and I would say the most unhappy people were ordinarily those that hadn't really proofed their pedal board ideas before they paid somebody to do it. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard to sort of backwards learn your pedal board when there isn't any, when you haven't actually learned how to do wet dry, or you haven't experimented with wet dry wet, and you're relying on somebody to set it up for you. And then you're like, oh, I didn't realize that this is what this is, or I didn't realize that this is how I need to set up these particular pedals in order to get this type of sound. And so it can create a lot more frustration amongst the customer if it isn't a process that they've really well vetted. And I almost feel like the advice that I still give people is the happiest people with their pedal boards are those that are the best editors of what they actually need and what they actually use. So, like, never build your pedal board around the 10% sort of fringe contingencies. Like definitely build it based on like the 90% core things that you use all the time. And you can use insert loops and other sorts of things to incorporate sort of the more auxiliary effects that are not part of the core sound, because, you know, every single device that you add, this is another point for failure. This is another point for complication. And most people are not willing to be great editors of their tone, and they really just want to have like everything. And those are invariably the boards that we would end up rebuilding, because they would say this is just too much, or I don't use half this stuff.
Too heavy.
Have you had this particular experience amongst your customers?
Yeah, and that's a learning curve. I mean, in the beginning, we'd have people come to us and they want a giant pedal board. And it's like, okay, wow, that's awesome. Let's build it. And it was a fun build. But then 2 years later, they have back problems, and they have to buy a bigger car. Like one of the guys couldn't fit it in his car. And, like it's just these things that you have to think about. And I think your advice is solid in terms of instead of I'll phrase it this way. The most common things that comes up is like, oh, you guys did the layout. There's room for one more pedal. What should I put on there? And instead, I really think the thinking should be, and this is what we've adopted, more recently, is in terms of what can you take off the board? Like, what is the least amount of pedals you can put on this thing and still make a functioning board that you're happy with? And one of the luxuries I have, and other people that build boards or just have the extra time on their hands, is you can redo your board all the time. And one of my favorite exercises, when my board starts to get a little bit too big, I've added, I add a pedal every once in a while, and before you know it, my board is massive again, is to cut it down to as few pedals as I possibly can, like 4 or 5 pedals. And then I have to create the same sounds. I have to create the same, experience with that smaller pedal board. And it's a creative exercise. It's hard work, and it's awesome. I absolutely love tiny pedal boards and trying to get the most out of them, rather than, we've all been there, when you have a giant board with these digital effects that can do anything under the sun, you only ever use a couple sounds on each pedal, and you never learn what the pedal can actually do, because you're just overwhelmed with option paralysis. And so sure. I think the exercise of trimming back your board as often as you can, like you said, using those insert loops for when you do need to insert a whammy into your signal chain or a wah, whatever it might be, is great. Right. But make your core sound as small as possible and make it awesome.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. And bringing back to the wet dry thing, there's one product that I've been talking about a lot that I think is actually, like, if people really want to do wet dry, it's like the simplest way to do it. And Source Audio came out with this product called the Collider. I'm sure you've probably seen them around. And the unique thing about this particular device is that it's delay and reverb in one, and it's sort of like the core elements of the Nemesis and the core elements of the Ventress, which are kind of their independent delays and reverbs. And then it's put them into one device, with which there's also a parallel mixer, and they have the kill dry and the analog dry through, and sort of all the checked boxes that you would need to sort of facilitate a proper wet dry wet rig. And the easiest way that I found to do a wet dry wet rig is you still maintain whatever your ordinary dry path is, distortion effects, etc. You run those in front of your amp. Then you take your line out box, and that will then feed the input of the Collider. And generally, and I don't know if you found this, but when you look at a lot of the signal paths of sort of the really classical wet dry wet rigs, whether it's a Van Halen Bradshaw era rack or a Steve Lukather or a Michael Landau or whatever, they're really only running delays and reverbs typically at the 100% wet parallel mix level. They're not running choruses or tremolos or any other sort of modulation effects in that. Those are all before it gets to that point where everything goes 100% wet. And usually the chorus is the last serial effect that splits out to the stereo parallel mixer. And so you can run all that stuff in front of the dry amp. But when you go out of the line out of, the output transformer padded down to line level with the level control on it, that comes into the collider, and then the collider goes out stereo to a GFI cab Zeus, which, is sort of mimicking, it's really designed to be the cabinet, but you're using it in essence as the combination of your speaker cabinet and your power amp in a way, even though it's not occupying necessarily the qualities of a power amp. The output on a wet rig is pretty linear. Like a lot of the speaker cabinets that people would ordinarily use had fairly colorless speakers. Sometimes it was vintage 30s, but more often it was EVM 12Ls. So about as, no speaker distortion, presumably through that. Very linear sounds. And even when if you were using a power amp, it was usually something that was pretty linear comparatively to what it was out there at the time, or even guys like Larry Carlton would actually just go into a powered monitor, would just go into a JBL Eon or a QSC, and that was the power amp and the speaker, because you really didn't need color on the wet. You wanted it to be linear and transparent and not have any tube distortion or color generally, and you would just want it to be clean, as though you were bringing in that effect from the mix bus. And I think that that's the easiest way that I've been able to accomplish a true wet dry wet, or is close to true, minus having the power amp with the GFI. And I think it works really well, because it kind of gives you you have your tube amp mic, that's channel 1, and then when you're going out of the GFI left and right, you have those as channel 2 and 3 for your wet left and your wet right. And so you can have all those benefits of the wet dry system. And that's a pretty small and compact way to do it. The only real, issue is you have to have a line out box that lives somewhere around your amplifier. Or I guess you could build it in if you wanted to the interface, if you want to have these long speaker cables coming back and forth. But I think that that's the easiest way to do it. But the other thing I wanted to say is that I think the easiest, like really what those guys were going for and really kind of analyzing the wet, dry, wet thing, they were really just wanting to run stereo rigs, and they couldn't integrate studio effects into a rig in any other way, because all of those effects that they were using at the time, the lexicons and the eventides and all that, they were only 100% wet. They were return only, so you couldn't use them like a ordinary guitar pedal is now. Yeah. And so the consequence was that they had to bring in the rain mixers, and they had to adapt the stuff that they were used to having in a studio and then put it into a rack. And essentially what they were just creating was their own mobile studio on wheels that had all the processing effects that they would want to use on the guitar when they were in these sessions with all these different bands and artists and stuff like that. And they could take that and wheel it to Sunset or wheel it to Capitol or wherever it was that they were recording, and they could have. And the other benefit is that they didn't have Pro Tools. And so anything that you recorded was printed to the track. So if you had wet, dry, wet, you would always have your dry. And so you could always reamp that, or you could always use that and then the engineer could add in their own processing after the fact. But you, at least in the moment in the studio, could have all of your processing effects, and that would all be happening, or you could still do post-production on the dry sound if the delay wasn't quite in time, or the producer decided that they were going to go a different direction and they didn't want to use dotted eighth delays or whatever it was that you set up your thing to do. And that was also, sort of a consequence of the time. But really they were just trying to run stereo rigs. And I think the simplest way to really do what they were intending to do then, but just didn't exist, was a stereo rig with 2 amps that had effects loops. I think that's the closest way to get there, because you can return into the power amp of 2 amplifiers for your stereo, and you have your dry amp is still the primary, and the second amplifier for stereo is just being used as a glorified power amp. You're going only into the return of the stereo amp. You're not doing anything with the preamp section or anything like that. And I think that that's really the closest way. And, you can use stuff that's not in a parallel mixer because a lot of times they were still blending back in the dry anyway. And so they were just kind of doing what you could do in a Strymon or a Boss DD500 or whatever, but they just had to kind of go about it really backwards because the equipment didn't allow for that application.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's cool to, be in the time that we are with where guitar effects are coming. Because, like you said, you have the Collider, which has built-in parallel. You have HX Stomp, and you can mess around with parallel effects in there as well. One that's in just on the desk in front of me is the Poly Digit as well. And you can route all sorts of parallel paths on that thing. And you can buy less and less gear. And again, select your pedals wisely. And you can get some of these sounds that, like you were saying, you'd need a full rack to do back in the day. And now it's like, a few $100, and you can start experimenting with it with specific pedals. And it is a different sound running parallel effects. And the thing that most people don't think about is if you run a parallel delay and reverb, and you're used to a series delay and reverb, they will not interact with each other. And how I always tell people when we're talking about it on the phone, it's almost like you're doing one take with just your reverb, and that's the guitar take. And then you're doing a completely separate take, the exact same thing with just your delay. You aren't going to get delay repeats feeding into a reverb. It's going to sound completely different. And that's, again, neither good or bad. It's just a preference, or it's an approach that you can take. And so, I think it's really exciting. I love going back and forth between a series rig and a parallel rig, running, the effects loop or right into the front. And you can there's just a whole palette of sounds available. And once you get rid of the notion of one's better than the other, maybe one serves a certain purpose better than another at a certain context. But it's really exciting to see what you can come up with. Again, if you just take the time to just see what you like before committing to something. Don't rush into it.
I think that's the hardest thing, is restraint.
Yep.
And
but we have the time now. People aren't really gigging at the moment. Like, now's the time to just get into it. Rip your board apart and see what you can come up with.
Yeah, and then if they don't want to take that on themselves, if they would watch my channel, they can come and call you, and you can do that. So, kind of thinking about somebody who's interested in building a board, they're considering hiring somebody professionally to do it. What does that process look like if somebody they call Goodwood or they email Goodwood? What does the process look like? What does the structure look like? You mentioned that you have sort of different kind of satellite locations or hubs that people can then sort of like mail their stuff into, and then it still gets the Goodwood treatment, so to speak, but it could be in presumably different locations from different builders. What does that structure kind of look like to the degree you're willing to share? Business started in Sydney, Australia. That was the first location, and we still have one set up there now. And so we now have a shop also in Redding, California, and we do setups there. David Paleo, he does all of our North America setups, and he's extremely talented at what he does. He's, I don't know if OCD is too harsh a term, but he's got an eye for detail, and it's really cool to see what he puts out. He's way better than I am at doing setups, infinitely better than I am. And so it's cool to see that, and I feel very fortunate to have him as part of the company. And so basically, people would book a call to show their interest. Like, I want to look into what the process might look like. They would chat to me, and we would go through their whole rig. We'd go through their signal chain, their preferences, what they liked about their previous or current board, what they want to see changed, what's frustrating, and what's the current situation look like. And then I would essentially give them a quote after that, and if they want to move forward, they can. And depending on what location they're closest to, depends on where we do the setup. So if you're, down the road in Sydney, Australia, I'm not going to ask you to ship your gear to California. Sure. And likewise, if you're in North America, you're not going to be sending it over to Australia. And so then we would work closely with them at that point to make sure
that we actually give them a final product that they're excited to use and create music with. And so my biggest priority, even on that first call, and I tell customers, like, my biggest priority is to understand what you're after and what's in your head. It's not to, impose my beliefs on what a signal chain should be. My biggest job is just to listen. And so I take a lot of time just listening to their experience so far with pedal boards. And it might be that I had this monstrous pedal board and I never touched 20% of the pedals, or I never touched 50% of the pedals. Like, all right, let's get rid of them and let's get your board as small as it can possibly be. And so that's kind of the overall process, I guess. I mean, I feel like I have the best job in the world, where I basically get to chat to customers about gear all day, and I learn a lot from hearing about, what pedals they like, what they used, and why they didn't like it, why they did, and it's a pretty fun job to be able to do that. And then I hand it off to the guys that really know what they're doing as far as the setup goes, once I have all those notes. And we build, custom junction boxes for them to suit their specific needs. And then we do the setup as well and integrate it all into one clean, hopefully tidy package.
What would you say is sort of the balance between neatness and the sound? And this is one thing that comes up often, and as somebody, you mentioned David Paleo out in Reading, and how beautiful a job that he does. A lot of people who are kind of watching from the DIY side, I think often are sort of wondering what that balance looks like. And then if their cable runs aren't as clean as David's or some of the other pedal board builders that they may see on Instagram or YouTube or Facebook, what do you think is sort of the balance between functional versus aesthetic, and what's sort of the cutoff in your mind?
I think it has to serve its purpose. Like that, at the end of the day, if your pedal board isn't serving its purpose, it's not a great board for you. And so, we, again, in that call, we talk to people and we say, like, what pedals are most likely to change? What ones are you going to swap out for a new delay? Or do you love, trying out new overdrives when they hit the market? And we will plan for those pedals to change and how we cable it and how we power it, all that type of stuff. And so the functionality side for me is very high on the list. Presenting a product that we are proud of and we want to show to the world is also just below that. And so I would say that, the neatness side of it is something that certain customers really want and really care about. Just like you'd want, a beautiful new guitar. Like if guitar A looks better than guitar B, but they both sound the same, I mean, which one's better? Depends who you talk to. And, certain people have different preferences. I would strongly, encourage people to not go for a clean looking pedal board at the expense of functionality. I just think that's, personally, my opinion, that's a mistake. And so at the end of the day, I mean, we tie down our cable channels. We try and make them look really clean, especially if it's an angled board where your cables are underneath. You don't want that catching on things as you're pulling your pedal board out if they're loose. You don't want it having people tripping over cables around your board. Like, that's all stuff that tying down a cable channel takes care of. But by no means does it have to be absolutely perfect, not a cable out of place for it to still be functional. It's just something that a lot of our customers are after. They want a clean, professional setup that they can rely on for upcoming tours or however they use their rig. But no, I'm not under any illusions that cleanness is gonna, make you play like Van Halen or make you a better guitar player in any means.
Yeah, I think that I noticed that people sort of want to sort of understand the balance, or that people might be maybe overcritical of themselves if their first attempt at making their own pedal board maybe doesn't resemble something that you would make, at Goodwood or something like that. And I've tried to sort of temper that to say that, if you look at some of the, Bradshaw rigs and stuff like that, they're actually, I mean, they're not messy, but there's not as much of a premeditated effort to make every cable kind of maintain its position in the loom, and that they'll kind of end up invariably sort of on top of each other. And I think the consequence of that is, and the reality is that those sort of things don't affect the end result in terms of the way that it sounds. Like there's sort of a spectrum of neatness, and David Paleo might be on one end of that, and then, somebody else may be on the other end of that. And if they're kind of within this standard deviation, the output is going to be the same, or the result will be the same, but it doesn't necessarily have to look like David's in order to be, functional and good and have all the qualities of tone. And so sometimes I try to sort of temper people's expectations that it's probably not going to look that good the first time that you do it, because you start to learn, how you need to sequence things in order for them to come out looking like that on the opposite end. And that's, I guess you could teach somebody that, but really, you'll sort of learn it inherently when you've done it, 50 or 100 or however many times, you've built a board.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was just kind of, that was where I was going with it.
I think honestly, your time would be much better served rather than practicing your cable channels. It would be much better served understanding your gear and messing around. Like I'm still blown away by some of the tests I do on signal chain and how pedals react when the order has been changed. And so even still, I do experiments with that and try and predict the outcome and then do the test. And sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong. But my time is better served personally as a guitar player understanding my gear than it is having a board that looks pristine. In saying that, I mean, some people just really want a clean looking pedal board, and that's not right or wrong. But like you said, it's not gonna make you sound better at the end of the day. Yeah. It's just it's what your pedal board will look like, and if that's what you want, great. If not, then I go back to working on your signal chain, getting new sounds, practicing your scales. I mean, create some music.
So I want to get into some of the gear related stuff, which I think is something that people always like to kind of know, where those that are in the industry or kind of are exposed to a lot of the different things out there, what they kind of rely on. I want to start with switchers, since this is sort of very explicit to the type of stuff that a lot of your boards will have on them. What would you say are, and I don't want to make this a thing where it pits you against other manufacturers, but maybe let's say, like, what would be your top 3 switchers that you would recommend to a customer that, say, wants to get into doing it, they want to get into using a switcher? What are going to be sort of Grant's / Goodwood's top 3 switchers that you might recommend to somebody?
There is not one size that fits all, unfortunately. I wish there was, because it would make things easier for everyone. But I think, again, it comes back to what you want to actually do with it. And so some of our customers, when it comes to MIDI or just a true bypass strip, where you just take pedals in and out of your signal chain with a true bypass strip, if someone just wants some basic control and they just want to up their game just a bit from where they're currently at, I often get them to check out Disaster Area. They do like an 8-loop, it's not true bypass, but they do an 8-loop strip, and you can turn pedals on and off, by hitting one button. You can create some combinations of loops or pedals that you can turn on and off by hitting one button. And so it's a good gateway switcher, if I can say that. And so if they want to do that, that's a great switcher. If someone wants to get a bit more complex in the switcher and MIDI control, I am a huge fan of RJM. I think they create some of the best switchers available. But the difference from the Disaster Area stuff is there's a steeper learning curve to get into it. And if you don't want to learn how to program MIDI in a more detailed environment, it's not the best product for you, although it can do the basics. If you you just want to stick with absolute simple stuff, go with like a Disaster Area. One I've been working with the last week, which is now I'm quite impressed with, is the Morningstar stuff. And this is more for MIDI. They do an ML5, which is a 5-loop true bypass switcher as well that you can program. But their programming environment is...
But they're sort of segregated though, right? Like the switcher is separate from the the actual or the loops are separate from the switcher.
Correct. Yeah. So it's a MIDI controller that can talk to a separate 5-loop true bypass strip or any other true bypass strip that's MIDI capable as well. But their programming environment is probably in between Disaster Area and RJM in terms of complexity. RJM is like, if you want to get as detailed as possible, you want to go down that road and create some pretty complex stuff. And you can go back to simple with RJM as well. But Morningstar's, right in the middle, and then Disaster Area is great for someone that's taking their first steps, I think, into some MIDI control and wants, banking, tap tempo, and some true bypass options is a great next step. So again, I don't think that there's one switcher that fits everyone's use. I think you need to ask yourself, what do you realistically want to do with it, and then find a product that suits it. And so yeah, it would be Disaster Area, Morningstar, RJM.
Got it. Now, what about power supplies? What do you think what are Grant's / Goodwood's top 3 power supplies?
Man, again, I think it kind of comes down to where you're going to be touring or playing is a big one. I think if you are 100% always going to stay within North America or whatever country or whatever country you're in, the Voodoo Labs does a great power supply. It's super reliable. It's has the transformers in it rather than doing like a switch mode option. But the other thing I always tell people, like, is there a chance you're going to go overseas and play, instead of playing at a 120 volt venue, it's going to be at 240. If there is, then I would not go with something at a fixed voltage just because you don't know what kind of backline you're going to get. And so at the end of the day, we often recommend the Strymon supplies for our customers. They're a little bit more expensive, but you don't have to worry about any change in voltage in terms of countries. You just plug in a cable and that's it. That's the end of what you need to think about. I like them because they still have the 2.1 mil barrel. Seox has some really impressive specs. I'm not as much personally a fan of the RCA plug to power the pedals, but that's personal preference. That's not
It's a better connector, though.
What's that?
It's a better connector, though.
It
2.1
is. It's very sturdy, and it's a great connector. But it's just harder to replace on the fly if something was to go down at a isolated venue somewhere. So I really like the Strymon stuff. The Seox, again, if you're a fan of the RCA, the specs are really impressive on the Seox supplies. Yeah,
man, just like the fact that, or at least on their switch mode ones, you have 9 to 18 on every output.
Yeah,
it's and so like that's handy, especially from a routing perspective. Like I know. And from building rigs, it's like when you have to channel something to a specific output, it's not like the end of the world, but it's a little more complicated. Where here you don't have to have any sort of cognition about how you're being really deliberate about where something goes, because everything just can go to 18 volts.
Yeah.
So that's really handy. But I do hear you on the downside of it, and I don't like their power cables. I don't like the seamed coaxials. They're harder. I mean, there's no functional downside, but they're just harder to deal with.
Yeah.
Like to make them look really neat, as opposed to a standard cylinder shaped insulated coax. But yeah, I agree. I think that they're great. And then, of course, I don't know if you've checked out the new Voodoo Lab stuff that is switch mode, like the 3 and 3 Plus and the X4. ISO 5 is not switch mode. That one's
isn't
still
it?
Linear. No, they have the Pedal Power 3, 3 Plus, X4, and X8 are their only switch mode ones.
I need to look into them then.
Yeah, all the other ones are linear. The issue that I've had, though, I mean, even with the fixed voltage thing, and if you're in your country of origin and you're never leaving, if you're putting risers or it's going under, I have found that there are problems with the chassis that are not steel. because the Pedal Power 2 has the steel chassis, but that's the only one that has the steel chassis. All the other ones have aluminum because of the increased power and the heat dissipation, and they're really not toroids either. They're kind of like a semi-toroid. And so the challenge sometimes I've had is that if you're going to put them near other products or you're going to put a hinged riser over it, that you can often get stuff in the magnetic field of the transformer, and the more current you draw against a toroid, as you know, the more it intensifies the field. And so if you have a 2 amp total supply and you're at 1800 milliamps, it's going to be worse than if you're only drawing 1 amp against it. And so that's the only issue that I've really had with those. And it's been difficult to sort of temper the delivery of that, because I really like Voodoo Lab and I think the quality is good. But I also think that there's a huge shortcoming in the way that they did that, and the leakage of the magnetic field can be really problematic, in particular on a pedal train or something where the pedals are in the direct field, in getting some noise that way. And that's just not something that can be overcome once it's present. And so usually, the only time I would ever use them is if they're like way in a corner and there's nothing that's on top of them, or, too close to the magnetic field. And I don't know if that, maybe I'm unique in that experience, but we've had a lot of people that have kind of reported this problem. And I certainly noticed it, years ago when the steel chassis were only used on the Pedal Power 2, which does produce some shielding there. But, that's kind of one reason why I've just pushed a lot of people or encouraged them just to go switch mode, because there's just this is not a concern anymore. It can be anywhere. You don't have to have the same issues with the wah pedals either, with the inductor and getting close to the transformer and all that stuff. So it's just like one less thing to worry about.
I remember this was years ago. We were doing a setup for someone. This is one of those learning opportunities. And we had a old Seox supply. I think it was a Seox Atom.
Okay.
And we put a pedal right beside it. And it's
Is that the one that does AC?
Sorry?
Does that one do AC?
I'm sorry, you cut out.
Does it have AC outputs on that one?
We weren't using any AC outlets, but we had put a pedal right beside it, and we were drawing decent current. And I'd never had any issues with Seox because they're really well built. And we finished everything, tested every cable, plugged it in, excited to hand it back to the customer. And we're getting this like hum in the rig and could not figure out what was going on. It was for a bass player. And we eventually, found that this one pedal right beside this Seox power supply, it was butt up against it. Couldn't get any closer. As soon as we picked it up, still plugged in, and we just moved it away, the hum, disappeared. And I had no idea what was going on at this point. This was so long ago. And then brought the pedal back and dropped it, and the hum was back. And it's like exactly what you're talking about. Like there's this, the magnetic field was getting to this audio path and creating this hum that was coming out of the amps. And we basically emailed Seox and like, what's going on? And this old power supply was not properly shielded. And so I think what we ended up doing for that one is we replaced it for another Seox supply, and instantly the problem was gone. But it was one of those learning things. It took me hours of just moving it, like testing cables and trying to figure it out, pulling my hair out, trying to figure out why this new sound was in the audio path. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things, like you said, you just can't get rid of it. So choose your power supplies wisely. Like there is a difference, in different supplies beyond, does it have enough milliamps and the correct voltage outputs for me? You need to think through some of this shielding stuff as well.
Yeah. Getting to pedals, and I think that, I want to sort of temper this with that a lot of times we like specific pedals, but they don't always work well in the context of a rig. And I think one benefit of doing the things that we do, or at least that I formerly did, is it gives us a lot of repetition and exposure to pedals that tend to work well with other pedals. And as somebody that manufactures guitar pedals, independently of any of the stuff that we're doing with, the podcast and YouTube and stuff like that, is that it's a huge asset to have built rigs for a long time, because a lot of pedal designers make their devices with the presumption, or maybe not with the presumption, but with the environment where they're very isolated from everything else. And presumably once they get into real life, they're going to be used with other dissimilar devices before and after it that may have different impedances, and can range greatly, and that may affect the behavior of the device that you've designed. So I found it to be very helpful in that I sort of designed to the degree that's possible within the confines of the circuit to be impervious of whatever's on the the input and output of the pedal, so that the pedal is not at all going to be susceptible to issues. But I also find that we identify certain pedals over time that really are transcendent, maybe across the years, that seem to work really well in the context of pedal boards. And so I want to kind of get some of Grant's hot takes here on maybe like what some of those devices are in sort of the big food group categories. Is that something that you're willing to entertain?
Oh man, let's give it a try.
All right, so let's start kind of like thinking beginning of the chain. This is kind of a complicated one, wah pedals, because they can be sensitive, especially the vintage styled versions. What have you found works really well on rigs in your experience?
I have to be honest, and people might stop listening after this, I am not a wah guy. I have never, it's like funny because my very first pedal was a wah. It was just a classic Jim Dunlop wah, and I had no idea how to use it. And ever since then, I've just not been a huge wah guy. So I don't have a huge back catalog of knowledge of when a customer asks me, like, what's your favorite wah? I basically just say, what I just did. And I will do research for you if you need more info, or I'll talk to Mason from Vertex if, we need to come up with a better wah. But basically, my default is to put it as early in the chain as possible. If it's vintage, it's first up, before any buffers, and it sees the guitar. But I don't have like this, I like, this is my absolute favorite. If I can't get this, I go for this. If I'm playing, 70s or 80s funk, I always go for this wah. I just don't have that up my sleeve, unfortunately. But I do put them first as default and test them out beforehand to make sure that it actually works the way it's intended to.
I would say full tone is a good sort of like it's pretty impervious to everything. It doesn't have the vintage wall look, which for some people is like really a deal breaker. but I would say that if you're ever in doubt, the full tone Clyde is pretty indestructible, and it's more reliable than any other wall. Like I don't know how he makes them as cheap as they do. Yep. They're so well built. Yeah. But anyway, okay, so that's wahs. What about fuzzes? What do you find works well in the context of a pedal board when we're talking fuzz pedals? Man,
it's just like I feel like this is getting into like what's the best overdrive. Like there's just so many options out there if you're,
But let's curtail it to just what works well on a pedal board, because we know that most fuzzes suck when you put a buffer with them. So if we're talking about like, fuzzes that you think are workable in the context, if somebody says, Grant, I need a fuzz for this rig, it needs to be workable. It can't be the size of an original fuzz face. What do we do?
Oh, you just got rid of my favorite fuzz. Then is it can't be the size of an original fuzz face.
You get those little Dunlop ones.
Sorry.
You get those little Dunlop ones.
Yeah, there you go.
Like donuts.
Or like mini foot fuzz, JHS.
Uh-huh.
My absolute favorite, I still remember the first time I heard it, and it blew me away on a pedal board setup that we were doing, was the Apocalypse by Death by Audio.
Okay.
It's a big pedal. Like it's not a small pedal that you just slot in because you want an occasional fuzz sound. Like it's a purposeful fuzz, and it absolutely blew me away. It sounded great anywhere in the chain, and it was comes with a bunch of options. If, however, you aren't one to take up a lot of space with a fuzz, because it's not it's not in that top used category. I really enjoy using the Cusack Scruz, whether it's an always on or the one with the foot switch on it. It's a no frills pedal. Like there's not a whole lot to get wrong on it. Again, it sounds good anywhere in the chain. If that's too simple for you and you want something with a little bit more color to it, something that'll kind of stretch you creatively, I think the ZVEX Fuzz Factory is, with a gated option and everything. It's a pedal that you can make some really ugly, and that's not in a bad way, you can make some really ugly sounds on that thing, and it's incredible. And you can kind of go a little bit more friendly on that as well. But it's a classic. Like, it's just such a cool pedal. And yeah, that would probably be a few of my choices.
What about when we're talking like dynamic pedals, like compression? What are you liking on rigs for compression?
For compressors, I prefer ones that color your sound a little bit. Other people, that's a swear word. You just can't have a compressor that colors your tone. I remember the first time I played John, again from Bondi Effects, his 2026. We're friends with him, and we're both out in Sydney, so we kind of were with him on the development phase a little bit and just hearing from him and what he was finding. That is a truly transparent compressor. He's done such a good job for people that love transparent compression. I remember using it and missing the color that I was used to. And so I think for someone that wants a transparent compressor that is in a size that is pedal board friendly, I would check that out. For someone that wants a bit more color from their compressor to more affect the EQ as well, I'm a big fan of whatever Kali puts out. Like Kali 76 Compact. Again, it's not a cheap pedal, but it sounds great.
Cool. I'm gonna go rapid fire here because I know that we're coming up on time for you. So, overdrives. What would you say? I know that it's hard to restrict it to maybe a few, but things that you found that historically work really great in the context of a pedal board.
No one's gonna be surprised by this, but I take this pedal off my board and it always makes it back on. Is a TS-808. I mean, it's the most well-known overdrive for a very good reason. I love that. For ages, I used an RC booster. I know I'm not putting out the most exciting and sexy effects, but these are the ones that I come back to. The other one right here, let me unplug it for you. This guy.
Okay, the Kingsley
Squire. It's a tube preamp. I use this for... I just realized we weren't actually on video. We're on a podcast. A Kingsley Squire. I put it before my amp and cab sim, and it's always on, and you can't get a bad sound out of it. It's awesome.
Nice. What about for boosts?
I know I already mentioned the RC booster.
RC.
Again, I haven't used a ton of boost pedals. I'm trying to think if there's any that have come in the shop that have stood out to me, but yeah, I don't have any that I've really put on my board. I usually end up pushing my amp with my overdrives and getting that sound out from there. But again, RC Booster is super clean, super easy to use, and has a great EQ section. Very good EQ section.
What about for modulation stuff? We're kind of grouping a lot of things together here, but what are some of your kind of standouts you'd say that work really great on rigs?
Again, I was just about to show you on camera, but I'm a huge fan of the Dimension C chorus. I just think it sounds awesome. I love the fact that you're limited. I love it when you get a little bit limited on effects and you don't have every option under the sun. No knobs on it, just some buttons, presets, and that's it. That's all you get.
The new one, I think you can combine multiple, though. And the original one, if you pressed one down, it released the other four or the other three. Yeah,
it's the same on the Waza. You can push multiples on that as well.
Yeah.
And they'll both be active, I guess. But I love a good chorus pedal. I'm not a huge tremolo guy, although that's a whole nother thing for trem. Chorus is definitely the one I always go back to. I love the micropog, and I love signal chain. Going back to that, I love the micropog after the overdrives.
Okay.
Right before you get into the modulation section, that's where I prefer putting pitch.
But you're probably not using it for like a 12-string effect in that position, or are you?
No, I usually use just up and down, or just up, just down. I'm pretty simple with Pog, but I just think
because I know that if you want to use it like as a guitar sim, Because some guys like to use it as like a 12-string effect. It doesn't work so well with tracking the further away it is for that.
Yeah.
What about for delays? What are your favorite delays?
I mean, everyone knows timeline, and like we're talking about time factor and all that type of stuff. I really like, as an affordable option, I recommend this to customers as well. Just a simple DD7 sounds incredible. If you want to expand on it, DD500 is great. There's so many delays out there. If you want like an analog delay or anything like that, I mean, there's just so many options available. But for me and for what I use, I used an H9 for ages, and that was delay only, and so many variations you can do within that. I mean, if you want an analog delay, you can't go wrong with a DM2. John's done his take on a DM2 with the, now I'm blanking on its name.
But it's like kind of the same color, the color profile. It's got the kind of the hot pink and
yeah, exactly. Yeah. But then it gives you some more modern options with MIDI and tap and all that type of stuff. But that, and then onto like reverbs. I think a Mercury 7 is awesome. I have the CXM 1978 in the shop right now. It's my first time playing it like 2 days ago. And it's very impressive. And I mean, the faders on it, it's so cool. I mean, it's not going to help you tonally, but looks-wise, aesthetically, I think they've just done such a cool job with that. And yeah, I don't know if that brings us to the end of the chain or not, but
yeah, I think that's mostly the end of the chain, and I think that this doesn't have to be the last time that we talk, so we can always continue the dialogue, and I also want to be respectful of your hard stop time here. So Grant, thank you for indulging the variety of questions that I have, and it's nice also just to be able to connect with somebody that has probably a large degree of shared experiences with pedal boards and in commonalities that may arise and exist within sort of the shared job that at least I did for a time, and that you guys are still doing at Goodwood. If people want to go and check out more about what you're doing, your products, your services, where is the best place for them to do that?
Instagram's probably the most common, at Goodwood Audio. Our website, goodwoodaudio.com, and we're also on this new app called Facebook. You can also find us there as well.
Oh yeah, the Blue F one.
Yeah, Blue F. I think that's the secondary name. Yep.
Okay,
good.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, again, Grant, thank you again for being here, and I hope that we get a chance to sort of revisit maybe some more of these things, and maybe talk on some specific ideas at some point in the future on a future podcast.
Love it. Thanks so much for having me, Mason. It's been a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Bye-bye. So that was Grant from Goodwood, and that was a really interesting conversation for me, just getting to talk with somebody who has a lot of the same shared experiences, and having done this for me over 10 years, and it seems like he's kind of in a similar boat in terms of when he started doing it, at least somewhat professionally. It seems like his background was a little bit more as a hobbyist, and then kind of got into it from there. But I think there's a lot of crossover in correlation here, and so it was nice to be able to reminisce a little bit and kind of think about some of those things, and then also get to hear a lot about his experience with gear and his picks, and kind of how he's evolved over time. And so this is all really interesting stuff that I think that you're also gonna dig, and I think it's gonna be helpful for everybody when they're sort of considering some of the nuts and bolts of rig building. Now, if you like what you listened to today and you want to support what it is that we're doing, you can do that by sharing this on social media, or subscribing to our podcast, or follow us on Instagram or Facebook or YouTube. And you can even support us financially by purchasing one of the products from Vertex Effects over on our website, or from an authorized dealer. Or you can go to therigdr.com, which is the Rig Doctor exclusive website where we sell all the products and materials that we build rigs with, including our pedal boards, pre-made cables using the high-end cables that we use across all of our rigs, All that stuff is available there. And you can also even join us on Patreon, where we have memberships as low as $4.99 a month. And we also have one-on-one consulting that we offer on therigdr.com. So if you just have a one-time question and you don't want to do a monthly thing on Patreon, you can do that as well. So do check out all those different things. And if you can't afford a Patreon or you can't afford a consult, you can always get a free account, which offers you sort of our basic level privileges and allows you to be part of our AMAs and our Q&As that happen every week live on YouTube. And you can be part of that select audience that gets to be part of the private chat that we do after our larger live streams. So definitely do send us an email, info@therigdr.com, if you'd like a free account. Otherwise, you can check out the paid accounts that are available there as well and on Patreon. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, which are Blue Microphones, for providing all the mics for the podcast, in addition to Diodario, who's giving us lots of different items for our giveaways that we do, and also our friends over at True Tone. And I want to give a shout out to Hunter Harrison for mixing the podcast, Mason Mejia for coming up with some of the concepts and co-producing, and Tim Marco for creating all the music. Until next time, I'm Mason Marangella, the Rig Doctor. Adios.